Dealings with the Dead, number 61. How long, O Lord, how long will thy peculiar people disregard the simple, unmistakable teachings of common sense and the admonitions of their own proper noses, and bury the dead in the very midst of the living? Above all, how long will they continue to perpetuate that hideous folly of burying the dead in tombs? What a childish effort to keep the worm at bay, to stave off corruption, yet a little while to procrastinate the payment of nature's debt at maturity. Dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. For what? That the poor, senseless tabernacle may have a few more months or years to rot in, that friends and relatives may from time to time be enabled, upon every reopening of the tomb, to gratify their morbid curiosity and see how the worms are getting on, that whenever the tomb is unbarred for another and another tenant, as it may often happen at the time when corruption is doing its utmost, its rankest work, the foul quintessence, the reeking, deleterious gases may rush back upon the living world, and, blending with 10,000 kindred stenches in a densely peopled city, promote the mighty work of pestilence and death. And let's remember that were this a biblical passage, the word Lord would be a mistranslation of God as a verb and noun. Who does not sympathize with Cowper? Oh, for a lodge in some vast wilderness, some boundless contiguity of shade, where the atrocious smells of docks and sewers, eruptive gas, and rank distillery may never reach me more. My lungs are pained, my nose is sick with this eternal stench of corpse and carrion, with which earth is filled. I am not unmindful that in a former number of these dealings with the dead, I passed over these burial grounds, and partially exhibited the interior of these tombs already, but there really seems to be a great awakening upon this subject at the present moment, at home and abroad, and I rejoice that it is so. I am aware that within the bounds of old peninsular Boston, no inhumations, burials in the graves, are permitted. This is well. Burials in tombs are still allowed. Why? This mode of burial is much more offensive. In grave burial, the gases percolate gradually. In a considerable portion may be reasonably supposed to be neutralized in transitu. This is unquestionably the case unless the grave is kept open or opened 6 times or more on the speculation principle for the reception of new customers. In tomb burial, it is otherwise. The tomb is open for newcomers, and sometimes most inopportunely, and the horrible smell fills the atmosphere and compels the neighboring inhabitants to close their windows and doors. As with some persons, this may seem to require authentication without leading the reader to every offensive graveyard in the city. I will take a single and a sufficient example. I will take the oldest graveyard in the Commonwealth, and the most central in the city of Boston. I refer to the Isaac Johnson's lot, where in 1630 his bones were laid. The chapel burying ground, the Savings Bank building, bounds upon that cemetery. The rooms of the Massachusetts Historical Society are over the bank. The stench produced by burials in the tombs in that yard during the summer of 1849 has compelled the librarian to close his windows. Tomb burial in this yard has not been limited to deceased proprietors and their relatives, It has, in some instances, been a matter of traffic. I have been struck with the present arrangement of the gravestones in this yard. Some ingenious person has removed them all from their original positions, and actually planted them all of a row, like the 24 fiddlers, or rather in 4 straight rows near the 4 sides of the graveyard. This is a queerer metamorphosis than any I ever read of. Ovid has nothing to compare with it. There they are, every one with its "here lies," and so on, compelled to stand forever a monument of falsehood. Of all the pranks ever perpetuated in a graveyard, this surely is the most amusing. In defiance of the lex loci, which rightfully enjoins solemnity of demeanor in such a place. And of all my reverence for Isaac Johnson and those illustrious men who slumber there, I was actually seized with a fit of uncontrollable laughter, and came to the conclusion that this sacrilegious transposition must have been the work of Punch or Puck or some lord of Misrule. As I proceeded to read the inscriptions, my merriment increased, for the gravestones seemed to be conferring together upon the subject of these extraordinary changes which had befallen them, and repeating over to one another, "As you are now, so once was I," as it happened in the case of Major Pitcairn. Should any person desire to remove the ashes of his ancestor, these misplaced gravestones would surely lead to the awakening of the wrong passenger, and some venerable old lady who died in her bed may be transported to England and buried under arms, for a majority of infantry who died in battle. Why continue to bury in tombs? Surely the sufferance on the part of the city government does not arise from a respect for vested rights. If the city government has power to close the offensive cellars in Broad Street and elsewhere, being private property, because they are accounted injurious to public health, why may they not close the tombs, being private property, for the very same reason? Considerations of public health are paramount when, upon an application from a number of the liquor sellers, wholesale and retail, in this city, Chancellor Kent gave his opinion, adverse to their heart's desire, if the license laws were constitutional. He alluded analogically to the power of the Commonwealth to pass sanitary laws. If the municipal power were deemed inadequate, legislation would give all the power required, for it would indeed be monstrous, having settled the fact that the public health suffered from burial in tombs, to suppose it a remediless evil. The slaughterhouses and tanneries which once existed in Kilby Street and Dock Square would not be tolerated now. Originally they were not nuisances. Population gathered around them. Their presidency availed them nothing. They become nuisances by the force of circumstances. The tombs in the churchyard were not nuisances when population was sparse, though they are so now. But the fact I have stated will increase evil from day to day. There can be no more burials in graves within the city proper. People will die, and as we have not the taste nor courage to burn, they must be buried. Where? In the tombs, which, as I have stated, is the most offensive and mischievous mode of burial. And cremation is rather bad on the environment, and the surviving bits having to, that's why there's the courage, well, at least part of it, is the breaking up of the bones. You tend not to have everything made to solid ash or something on its own. I have already alluded to some instances of traffic connected with certain tombs in the chapel yard. If some plan be not adopted, a new line of business will spring up, in which the members of my profession will figure to some extent. Many of the present owners of tombs will sell out and move their dead to Mount Auburn or Forest Hills, and the city tombs will be crammed with as many corpses as they can hold by their speculating proprietors. Rather than this, it would have been better to continue the old mode of earth burial. The remedy is plain. The fields are before you. carry out your dead. A famous preacher of eternal torment, and who always, in addition to the sulphurous complexion of his discourses throughout, devoted 3 or 4 pages at the close exclusively to brimstone and fire, is said upon a special occasion to have produced a prodigious effect upon the more devoted of his intensely agitated flock, by causing the sexton, when he heard the preacher scream brimstone at the top of his lungs, to throw 2 or 3 rolls into the furnace below, whose fumes speedily ascended into the church. This anecdote came instantly to my recollection some 20 years ago, one Sabbath morning, while attending the services in St. Paul's Church in this city. And let's remember, the biblical Sabbath is sunset Friday to sunset Saturday. The rector was absent, and a very worthy clergyman supplied his place. In the course of his sermon, he repeated in a very solemn tone, pointing downward with his finger in the direction of the tombs below, those memorable words of Job: "If I wait, the grave is mine house. I have made my bed in darkness. I have said to corruption, Thou art my father; to the worm, Thou art my mother and my sister." Almost immediately, the coincidence was wonderful. I was oppressed by a small offensive sense, which certainly seemed to be germane to the subject. It became more and more powerful. It seemed to me, and I call myself a pretty good judge, to be postuminous, decidedly. I certainly believed it to proceed from the charnel house below. My eyes turned right and left to see how my neighbors were impressed. The females bowed their heads and used their handkerchiefs. The males were evidently aware of it, but with a slight compression of their noses, kept their eyes fixed upon the preacher. 2 medical gentlemen, then present and yet living, pronounced it to be the worm and corruption, and connected it with the burial of a particular individual not long before. The case was carefully investigated by the wardens and others, who were perfectly satisfied that this horrible effluvium was very probably produced by the burning of a heretic in the form of a church mouse that had taken up his quarters in the pipe or flue, and was thus converted into an unsavory pastille. And that's happened with my heater a couple times. This mouse that found its way into the tubes